Changes and challenges facing China over an aging population. A new law says families must take better care of their elderly parents. China is aging fast, and so too is the wider world. And that's raising concerns over social welfare. This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. China has stirred family emotions with a new law making it compulsory for grown children to visit their elderly parents. It states that adults must take care of their parents' spiritual needs. The law is short on detailed frequency of visits or potential punishment, but courts could impose fines or jail terms. China is among the most rapidly aging countries in the world. UN figures show there are around 180 million people over the age of 60 in China, but that figure is expected to reach 487 million by 2050. Now, that would make up 35% of the population, posing a serious threat to China's social fabric and economic stability. We'll begin our discussion in a moment, but first, Scott Heidler reports for Inside Story from Hong Kong.
For centuries, it's been Chinese tradition to respect and take care of one's parents. In the teachings of Confucius, this is viewed as the foundation of all values. But even near the ancient philosopher's hometown of Chifu, there's clear evidence that ideal is declining in modern China. Now, more Chinese are putting their parents in homes for the elderly and in many cases, rarely visiting them. It's become so bad in the eyes of the government that it's passed a law giving parents the right to sue children who don't visit often enough.
Children should visit parents at least once a week. This is the bottom line, and it's far from enough. But unfortunately, many people just leave their parents here and ignore them. I hope the new law can make some changes.
Each person pays $250 a month at Liu's center. To make up for the lack of family visits, he brings in volunteers to chat with the residents.
If you don't care about your own parents, how can you treat other people nicely? You are not a human being.
In 40 years, the Chinese population 60 years and older will be nearly 500 million. Now, this new law is to preserve tradition, but it's also out of economic necessity to limit the government's burden in caring for them. And the one-child policy is making things worse. It leaves many lone children responsible for two aging parents and leaves many parents alone when children have to move to find work in the growing Chinese economy.
A lot of young people go to big cities to work. The parents are left in their hometown. It's a very sad situation for the elders. But can you really blame young people for pursuing a better life?
The new law will be difficult to implement. Rarely do Chinese people sue members of their own family. But the government hopes it will at least serve as social guidance for children, encouraging them to follow the words of Confucius. Scott Heidler for Inside Story, Hong Kong.
Let's go straight then to our guests in Beijing. Tania Lee, a journalist specialising in Chinese affairs. In our London studios, Danny Dorling, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Sheffield and author of the book Population 10 Billion. And from Brussels, Anne-Sophie Parent, Secretary General of Age Platform Europe. Welcome to all three of you. Thanks for joining us. Tania, I gather that there really is a mixed response to this law in China.
Yes, definitely. There has been a very mixed response. Just yesterday, the law came out on July 1st saying that parents could start suing their children if they didn't visit them enough. And just yesterday, when I checked online, there were 8 million responses.
Wow.
People who had added comments on the on Weibo, which is the like application here. And, you know, the response was mixed. Lots of people were saying that this is mocking them, mocking the children. It's a national embarrassment that the government has to put in these laws to make children visit their elderly parents.
Danny, what did you think when you heard about this law? I mean, did you sit up and take note?
It was quite surprising to see this law being passed. Getting to actually visit your parents every week is difficult if you live some distance away from them. So that was my first reaction: is how are some children actually going to manage to do this if they're living
geographic
in another city?
there.
Oh yes, yes.
Okay, so that was your first emotion, was how hard it would be. I mean, anything from it that you feel that it could be worked on, could be a good idea?
In general, it's a good idea if people visit other members of their family. The interesting thing is that there's almost exact correspondence between the fertility rate in China and the fertility rate of middle-class Americans. So there's the same issue as it is in America as it is in China. There's the same problem about young people not necessarily visiting their parents, particularly when they get quite old. Although as people really begin to age to very old ages, of course your children are also ageing. And then you may be a little bit less busy, say if you're aged 70 and your parents are aged 90.
Right, okay. Anne-Sophie, you are very involved in policy when it comes to the aged. What did you think of this? Is it bonkers or could it make sense?
No, I think the intention of the Chinese law is correct, is good. There is indeed a major problem with who should look after and even keep company for those very rapidly increased number of very old people. We do have similar problems in the European Union. It's just that it is addressed in a different way, maybe. But awareness raising is always good about that problem, because elder abuse and neglect is unfortunately still a big taboo.
So it's not a bad idea, it's just the application that's possibly questionable.
The application, at first sight will look difficult. As was mentioned earlier, in the European Union, it is now not so longer the case that children would be living close to their older parents. It depends on the countries, of course, but also the responsibility are not always lying on the families. But most families are looking after their older parents. But when it comes to very old people being put in nursing homes, unfortunately, we still have quite a number of them who do not receive any visits, sometimes for a whole year, and this is just not acceptable.
Oh, very sad. Tania, sticking to this law, how's it going to work? I mean, we don't know yet what it's supposed to be, if you're supposed to visit them once or twice a week, and how it'll be enforced.
Enforce, yes, exactly. That's the one big question everyone has on their mind. How is this going to be enforced? It is going to be very hard. I mean, first of all, the parent, if they feel like they're being neglected, they must sue them, and that means going to court. Some of our producers visited a nursing home recently, and they said that sadly, only 10% of the elderly people living in these nursing homes have regular visits from their children. And they find that if this law was to be put in place, it would be very embarrassing to have to take your child to court.
Embarrassing, but if the parent who's suing wins, then their child will have to pay. It'll be even more expensive. They might go to jail and they won't see their parents then anyway.
Yes, that's what the new policy implies, that there could be jail time for the child if they're found to be guilty.
I mean, does this smack of a government shirking its duty?
Well, yes. On the websites, all the netizens were saying that this was shameful of the government to actually put out this law, because I mean, it's the government's job. They say, some people say it's the government's job to actually take care of the elderly, to spend more money in aged care, considering they're dealing with a rapidly ageing population. It was their initiative from the very beginning to put in place the one-child policy late in the 70s, in the late 1970s. So if there's a massive ageing population problem here, lots of netizens and people are saying that it's up to the government to deal with this, and to help the aged care sector develop.
Danny, do you think the one-child policy is partially to blame for the problem?
I don't think it's as much to blame as people think. The one-child policy fertility rates in China beforehand had already fallen from 6 children per woman to just over 2. So it simply moved it down a little bit more. But it's resulted in a fertility rate in China which is, as I say, the same as middle-class Americans, and is still higher than that across all of Europe and much higher than that in Japan. So there are much faster issues of ageing in the richer parts of the world.
But if you look at the one-child policy, there's this 4-2-1 phenomenon. Child looks after 2 parents, and if they're lucky enough to have 4 grandparents, they look after them as well. I mean, that's difficult for anybody.
That's difficult, and also, of course, some elderly people will not have any children, and you've got to ask, well, who's going to visit them as well? I mean, this is part of the question about it being an issue for the state. Whereas those parents who've got 2 children, remember in rural areas it was easier to have 2 children than in cities in China, suddenly you're able to share the visiting and halve the amount of time that has to be given up to doing that. So I think it can't just be put onto children, but in general it's much better if you do visit your relatives. So anything which encourages that and also gives people the right to allow them to do that. You've got to look at what the employers are doing in China. Do they actually allow people to have the time off to be able to go and visit their parents should they wish to do that?
Now, let's branch out a little bit and look how big this problem, this growing aging problem is. Around the world, there are 810 million people who are above the age of 60. But this is projected to increase to more than 2 billion by 2050. Here's what that would look like. Starting with figures for last year, in Africa and the Indian subcontinent, less than 10% of the population is aged 60 or more. We can see how this figure increases across the Americas and Asia, Canada, Australia and Europe and the Nordic countries, to Japan, which has the world's highest percentage of elderly people, more than 30% aged 60 or over. Now, contrast that with this in 2050 and a significantly older world, the 60 and overs making up 1/3 or more of the population across large parts of Asia, Europe and Canada, with the Americas and Australia not far behind. Now, to put that into perspective, right now, 1 out of every 9 people in the world is over 60, but by 2050, that's projected to be 1 in 5. Anne-Sophie, what are the reasons that everybody, or the majority of people, are living longer?
Well, just big progress that have been achieved in the medical field, and the fact that people are better fed, are better protected, and this can only be valued and promoted. The major problem we see is not so much that we have longer longevity, but rather the fact that we do not age in such good health. We do have quite a number of years at the end of our lives when we develop chronic diseases and become dependent on others, in particular if the environment is not supportive.
So is that a given that the longer you live, the bigger the chance is that you won't be healthy?
Yeah. If you look at it like this, but we all know that if we look at the 80+ group, which is the group that is creating most concern in the European Union, for the moment it's 5% of the population already, and by 2050 it's going to be 12%. And this is the group we know for most of them will need some form of care, be it informal care, light informal care at home, or very complex and cost difficult care
and infrastructure in a nursing home as well, I should imagine.
Hospital. Yes, indeed, yeah. But there is a big trend in the European Union to move people out of institutional care, not only because it is costly, but because we have many people who are there and who shouldn't. They are perfectly able to stay at home if they get some adequate support from informal or professional care, but provided at home. This is a general trend.
Danny, China's aging population,
most older people would prefer.
Okay, has been described as a fast approaching tsunami. Do you think an aging country becomes less competitive?
No, this isn't a tsunami. This is a success. Aging is one of the great human successes. We are living longer because we are becoming healthier. China won't be able to do the trick it did do in its period of enormous economic growth, of having such a large working age population and not having to care for an elderly population. But China has managed to jump ahead so fast already that even having slightly lower growth, China's still going to do very well. It's not a tsunami. China may, though, have to look at perhaps letting a few younger people in from elsewhere in the world, and that's a new issue for China.
Because something
for
you
the places
brought up,
where there still is a surplus.
excuse me, jumping in here, which applies not only to China but the rest of the world, is that with this growing population there are growing fertility problems. That, I should imagine, would also have quite a dramatic impact on the workforce eventually.
Well, it's not a fertility problem. What's happened is we've brought our fertility down. It's been falling for 40 years now. We currently have on average 3 children per couple in the world. Our children are expected to have 2, and we're going to hit for stability. For the first time in centuries, the human population is set to stop rising, and this is a very good thing. It's not a fertility problem, but there are big differences in different parts of the world. In some cities, it's as low as 1 child per couple. In other rural areas, it could be 3, 4, or even 5. And so it's the migration of people, the moving of people from the countryside to the cities, and from countries with more people to countries that are ageing, that helps to balance this out. And where there's restrictions on the movement of population, you tend to make the problems worse, because the ageing populations don't get the young people they need, and the young people, where there's a surplus of young people, don't get to move to places where there is much more demand for them.
Okay, Tania, I've got an interesting statistic here. If you are born, and if anyone's born after 2000 watching this programme, particularly in France, Germany, Italy, the UK, and any countries with long life expectancies, there's a strong chance that you will see your 100th birthday, which is quite extraordinary. So there really is a thing that you better learn to love them.
Yes, you better learn to love them. And here in China, the life expectancy, the average life expectancy is 75 at the moment. And there's a huge trend of moving your loved ones when they need the care into a nursing home. And a lot of people are finding it very, very hard. They're finding it as an emotional burden and a financial burden, and very, very hard to move them in these nursing homes. Yeah, just because what we said before, they're living too far away from their parents, and it's not only, they're no longer in a usual family. The female and the male are both working, and they also have to take care of their young ones. So there's a huge trend of not knowing whether or not to take care of the elderly parents in their old age, or to put them in the nursing home. So,
and Tania, I gather another problem is
challenge.
people just not looking after their elderly parents well at all. And after this law was announced, I gather that on the social media platforms, people were talking about horrendous stories about how people look after their elderly. They make them sleep in pig pens.
Yes.
I'm sure you hear lots of awful tales.
Yeah, we heard that last story. Yeah, exactly. Last year there was a man from Jiangsu province who put his 100-year-old mother in a pigsty, and that generated a lot of criticism online. And so this is where a lot of Chinese people are facing these problems, and they've got this forum to talk about it. It's not just a problem, you know, that children have to, like grandchildren have to think about, parents have to think about, even the grandparents have to think about whether or not they want to put this burden on their descendants.
Here's another area of concern, both in China and globally, the proportion of older people living alone. The UN estimates that 40% of the world's elderly are living independently, but there's a big gap depending on where you live. Almost 3/4 of older people in more developed regions live alone or with their spouse, compared with, say, a quarter in less developed regions. But this is likely to increase as the world's population continues to age. What is the problem here, Danny? Is it because it's more sophisticated in developed countries? The wealthier you are, you lose the inability or the ability to care. Why the contrast?
When a country becomes rich, it's possible to afford more housing, and so it's possible for very large numbers of people to end up living on their own. In Britain, for instance, people are 20 times more likely to have their children live with them when their children are grown up than they are to have their parents come and live with them. but it does create a problem. It's very inefficient having very large numbers of people living on their own. And there have been surveys in Britain of elderly people to try to work out how interested they might be when they become single in meeting up with another elderly person, say, and starting a new relationship. Because if you could get two elderly people back together again, you save on a house and also on care. When one person becomes ill, the other person is there with them.
And wouldn't that be wonderful?
People... it would help a lot if we could go through more than one relationship in our lives if we have to.
And Anne-Sophie, as the world gets older, how can the elderly contribute more? What needs to change?
Well, this is what we're trying to promote, is thinking sooner about later, trying to have the baby boomer generation already planned not only for their parents' old age, but for their own old age. In general, in the European Union, most parents wouldn't like to fall and become a burden to their children. They would like to be able to cope for themselves for as long as possible. So promoting what we call age-friendly environments, enabling people to remain independent for much longer, and indeed promoting self-care and peer care, as Danny was saying. You have fantastic initiatives being taken. Rather than looking at feel your duty and expect everything to be provided by the children or grandchildren, looking at how the local community can look after their older citizens among themselves, helping them to help each other, and maybe mixing more the generations among themselves, so that you don't have whole cities with only, or towns in the rural areas with only aging people, but you have different generations together. This is a way forward, I think, and it should help address most of the problems we are facing for the moment. And it's a more, also a more quality life that you get out of such approach, rather than leaving everyone to care for themselves or to cope with their own problems.
As you can imagine, we got quite a healthy response to this when it comes to our Facebook page and posing this question about this new law in China. Mohammed Babin Larai says China should be commended for this landmark legislation to keep the family. After all, we are human beings, not animals. Brad Whitcomb disagrees, saying ultimately the result of such a policy will be even wider spread poverty, not just among the elderly, but their children as well. Governments have given up on this issue because it is unassailable. Abina Raphael tells us, in my part of southeastern Nigeria, it is an abomination for children not to take care of their parents. And Arya Apolinar in the Philippines adds, we don't need that law because it's already in our culture to take care of our folks. It's implanted in our hearts. And I suppose if it's not implanted in our hearts, Tania, it's important to know that everybody's going to get old.
Definitely, everyone is going to get old. It's just such a problem here. No one really knows what to do. There's lots of mixed emotions as to what to do with your elderly parent when they need their care. Do you move in with them? Do you move back to your old village, or do they come and live with you in the city? Do you put them in a nursing home? I mean, these negotiations are already taking place with young people who don't even have elderly parents yet. But they already feel that sort of, they call it the invisible and emotional burden that it has on them, just thinking about, you know, what they ought to do in the future.
And Danny, it's got to be more than the plastic surgery industry that benefits from an ageing population, doesn't it?
Yes, hopefully an older and wiser population will maybe realise that plastic surgery isn't such a great thing. Plastic surgery tends to be younger people. You've got to think, as we age, as you know, China's already at 75 life expectancy. As we age, we should hope to become wiser and a little bit less preoccupied with the things that young people are preoccupied, which includes looks.
Anne-Sophie, final thoughts?
Well, I just hope that the generations will discuss all that together and will come up with solutions that will be good for all of them, because as a parent myself, I'm a grandmother of 6 grandchildren, and I have had the luck to have seen my aging parents and father-in-law who is 100 years old.
Oh,
I just think the best solutions are those that you discuss together and agree.
We end with those sage words from the grandmum, Anne-Sophie. Thanking you to Tania Lee, Danny Dorling as well. And don't forget, you can find this programme and many more at aljazeera.com and also at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And do leave us your comments there too. I'm Jane Dutton. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.